interesting developments with the portal today. Julian Fleming from Ohio State, former five-star recruit who's been a contributor there for the last few years, announced his intention to go into the portal. Didn't have quite the year that they were expecting him to have, that Julian, I'm sure, personally was expecting to have. So took a step back from posting 6 touchdowns in 2022 to finishing this year with 26 catches without any touchdowns. And even though he's been on the NFL draft radar and a kid who I know Ohio State has been high on throughout the course of his career, now is going to hit the free agent market. And I would think, just based on the fact that the kid does have legitimate NFL ability, that regardless of the step back in production this season, we'll have some options there. But one of the latest developments today of note with Julian Fleming, former five-star recruit, announcing his plans to go in.
Right, very interesting stuff, Matt. Thank you so much for the update. We're going to take it back here in studio and talk a little bit more about the type of player that he is. You heard him mention he's a 5-star. He was our number 4 player in the 2020 class. What do you remember about him coming out of high school?
Well, I mean, he was part of a kind of a generational receiver class at Ohio State. You had him, you had Jackson Smith-Njigba in that class, you had C.J. Stroud come in at quarterback in that class, and he was the guy that was the guy in that class. And then you come after Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, so he was going to be the next guy. But then Jackson Smith-Njigba emerged that year, especially in that Rose Bowl game where Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson sat out. Then you had other young receivers come in, and now you got Brandon Ennis, you got Carnell Tate, you have Jeremiah Smith committed there. There's the possibility of Mecca Egbuka maybe coming back next year. So Fleming may have thought, after 4 years, this just isn't the place. Fresh start might be a better opportunity for him somewhere else. Maybe he goes back to Pennsylvania. Maybe he goes somewhere in the Northeast. But this is one that's a surprise. But now that's 3 former top 5 players between him, Dante Moore, Walter Nolan, that have now gotten in the portal. And I guarantee you the amount of suitors that those guys are going to have are going to be great, because there is still a lot of talent there with Julian Fleming.
There's a bunch of teams that need receivers. We just talked about Notre Dame earlier needing wide receivers. There's a lot of college coaches who've called and said, tell me who the top receivers on the board. Well, Julian Fleming is going to be right at the top, if not number 1. Loaded receiver room at Ohio State over his career. One guy that Brandon left out, Jamison Williams, also was in that receiver room and ended up leaving and going to Alabama to get more playing time. Imagine that, leaving and going to Alabama to get more playing time. So that lets you know how impressive that group of receivers was. This is a guy that's going to bring tremendous value to the right team, and if he can get hooked up with the right quarterback and a creative offensive coordinator. Also, don't forget about the Texas Longhorns. They also are looking for some wide receivers in the transfer portal. This could be a huge get for the right program.
We talk about this in the NFL sometimes when they're going through training camp, as you're kind of doing that math to see if you fit on this roster. It sounds like there's some math involved too, especially when you're in a loaded wide receiver room. I think it's safe to say they got a couple 5-star wide receivers coming in too, and will continue to do that in every single class. It's just what they do. I'm going to welcome in Patrick Murphy of bucknuts.com to discuss this. And Patrick, let's start with the latest news. Wide receiver Julian Fleming. It's a pretty easy statement to make that it is a loaded wide receiver room at Ohio State, but why do you think things didn't work out with him in particular?
It's been an interesting career for Julian Fleming at Ohio State, a 4-year guy who was obviously one of the highest recruited players coming out of high school, but the numbers just haven't been there production-wise. He's been a very solid blocker, but for his career, only 79 catches, has battled injuries throughout his time in Columbus, so it's been tough. And in a room like that, as you mentioned, is loaded as it has been, you have to produce. And I think Fleming's just looking for a different opportunity here and seeing if maybe he can find somewhere where he can kind of be more of the guy than sort of a second fiddle, so to speak.
Yeah, elsewhere on this Buckeyes offense, quarterback Kyle McCord has hit the transfer portal. What are you hearing as far as how that came to be?
Yeah, I think after the loss to Michigan, everybody at Ohio State kind of had to look themselves in the mirror, coaches, players. Ryan Day met with the team last week. It sounds like there were individual meetings, and one of those included sitting down with Kyle McCord and his family. And with the standard that is Ohio State football and the quarterbacks that have come through this program, they couldn't guarantee that Kyle was going to be the guy going forward. Not that they were pushing him out the door, but there are other quarterbacks in the program, Devin Brown, Lincoln Kienholz, who just finished his freshman season, and Aaron Nolan coming in, all 4-star prospects coming out of high school, and they were going to have to open the competition back up and figure out what was going to be best for this offense, which was good this year, but not to the level it was before. Obviously, McCord had to make a decision for himself at that point and decided to move on into the portal. And now Ohio State has to, kind of begin that process again of finding a starting quarterback as you head into the offseason and into 2024.
Yeah, our insider Matt Zenitz gave us kind of a look behind the curtain of what could have potentially happened there. And he said that it was maybe that Ohio State was looking elsewhere in the portal for a quarterback to come in. And so Kyle McCord, kind of doing that math, said, all right, it's time for me to look elsewhere. So who are some other quarterbacks that Ohio State might be interested in?
I imagine it would be someone probably who has a year remaining of eligibility, someone who could come in and add to what the Buckeyes have in that room and compete. I don't think that they would be looking at anyone long term unless there is that perfect fit. Ryan Day did go out and get Justin Fields out of the transfer portal a couple years ago, even though they had Tate Martell in the program. It would have to be, I think, somebody of that caliber if you're going to promise multiple years to a guy when you already have, as I mentioned, 3 other guys that are still in that room. So a guy whose name I've heard come up quite a bit, Riley Leonard from Duke. That's a guy who I know has been linked with Notre Dame, but I think Ohio State will get involved there. Any of these guys really who could come out and give the Buckeyes something different for maybe a season as they look to develop some of the guys already there that are a little bit younger.
So that's the, I guess, more long-term answer. Short-term, who starts at quarterback in the impending Cotton Bowl coming up?
That is going to be determined here in these next couple weeks. I would imagine if Devin Brown, who battled an ankle injury throughout the season, is healthy enough, and he was available towards the end of the year, that he probably gets the start just because of the experience factor. But it would not surprise me at all if Lincoln Kienholz, who just finished his freshman year, played 2 games, just limited snaps, does get an opportunity to show what he can do. And I think they'll really have a battle here leading into that bowl game against Missouri in the Cotton Bowl. I think it will ultimately come down to who plays well in practice, but if I had to pick one now, I'd probably say Devin Brown just based on the experience factor.
Do you think that Devin Brown is on the roster next season? What happens with him?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on what Ohio State ends up doing. If they do go get somebody out of the portal, it would certainly be understandable for Devin Brown to make a move. He obviously wants to play, right? And he's said before that he's a Buckeye and wants to stay a Buckeye. But if he's getting recruited over, not only coming out of high school but from the transfer portal, I could certainly see a path where he departs. I would imagine that would happen after spring, after he has an opportunity to go out and kind of showcase what he can do again. But it certainly is something to keep an eye on here with Devin Brown. And, does Ohio State end up with a completely different looking quarterback room as you head into the offseason?
All right. Thank you, Patrick, so much for being on the show. I know you're tracking a lot of things. Those are just the headliners, but there are some other Ohio State players who have hit the portal. So for that, we're going to bring it back here in studio. Huff, I know that you've been kind of tracking just different positions that have announced that they're going to transfer. The most important ones, of course, the quarterbacks. But what else are you seeing as far as Buckeyes leaving?
Yeah, I mean, there's been some obviously depth guys that maybe couldn't get on the field. I mean, that's the one. I guess it's a good problem to have when you have so much talent that elite players aren't getting on the field. We're seeing that with Julian Fleming. Comes in as the top receiver of the country. He's 4th, 5th in line at the receiver position. But Evan Pryor, that running backfield, you have some talent there that he just couldn't crack that logjam at the top. You've got offensive line like Jacob James, Victor Cutler that are leaving. So when you look at Ohio State, I mean, yes, they're losing guys, and then they're going to be able to get some guys from the portal. But what's going to be interesting is that there's going to be schools that will say, hey, these guys are talented players. They just happen to play at Ohio State where there was so much talent. These guys will end up being hot commodity even without extensive amount of film.